Welcome to Neuro Revolution. The world was not designed for us, so we are creating a new one. Hear the stories of neurodivergent entrepreneurs, creatives, and changemakers. The rebel minds changing the world. Hello, everyone. Today I'm welcoming Tiffany Yu, who is on a mission to increase intersectional disability representation and democratize visibility. Tiffany is a multi-hyphenate disability advocate, entrepreneur, and content creator. She is the CEO and founder of Diversability, which elevates disability pride, builds disability power, and advances disability leadership. She is the founder of the Awesome Foundation Disability Chapter, which offers monthly micro grants for disability projects, which has already supported over 78 projects in 10 countries. She is the host of Tiffany Yu podcast, which features conversations on all things wellness, impact, identity, and leadership. And she is the author of the Anti-Ableist Manifesto, Smashing Stereotypes, Forging Change, and Building a Disability-Inclusive World, which is what we'll be talking about today. So this isn't even a comprehensive intro covering everything Tiffany is and does. So I invite listeners to learn more and connect with Tiffany's work through tiffanyyu.com and support her powerful mission. So welcome, Tiffany.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, thank you for being here. I'm very excited. I have been reading your book. I'm so glad we get to talk about it. So since we're focusing on the Anti-Ableist Manifesto, I just wanted to mention that this came out in the US last October, and it will be released in the UK, Australia, India, and other countries this March. So would you share a little bit about your journey to creating this book and how it has come out of the advocacy work you've been involved in for so many years?
Sure. So my journey into this space comes based on my own lived experience. At the age of 9, I was involved in a car accident where my dad was driving and he unfortunately passed away. And I acquired a handful of injuries and disabilities, including permanently paralyzing one of my arms, and much later being diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, which is a type of mental health disability. It would take maybe a decade plus after that happened for me to find my voice and start to find my community as a disability advocate. So I can actually remember the dates where the day of the car accident was November 29th, 1997. And then the day that I started to explore reclaiming, owning, and at the bare minimum, accepting a disability identity was October 22nd, 2009. So that's about a 12-year gap there. So throughout this journey of creating Diversability, it was Georgetown's first ever disability student club. I had an opportunity to get to meet so many members of the disability community who I'm now proud to call my friends, but it made me learn how diverse disability is and how diverse our experiences are. So fast forward to 2020, when the pandemic first hit, and I was trying to figure out, after having hosted a lot of in-person events in some key cities where we were building Diversability's community, I was trying to figure out about how we would transition online. So this may be more detail than you want, but
no, please.
So I turned to social media. And I ended up starting a series on social media, a short form video series called the Anti-Ableism series. And it shared bite-sized ways that we can better show up for the disability community, whether it's adjusting our language or learning more about some of the stats and research out there about how large our community is, whether it was ableism that we were experiencing through different news headlines or stories that were flooding media headlines, or even the ways that we write media headlines. So a couple months after that, a literary agent reached out to me asking if I had ever thought about writing a book. And as someone who was very used to creating 15 to 45 second pieces, video clips, the idea of writing an 80,000 word book seemed extremely daunting and intimidating. So I actually said, once upon a time, I had a dream of wanting to write a book, but I just have so many things going on right now, I'm not sure that it will become a reality. And my literary agent, always have to give Charles a shout out. I don't know if you are pursuing the book process, but having a literary agent, if you decide you want to get your book published by, get it traditionally published or by one of the big publishers, you really want to find a literary agent who believes in your vision so they can talk about you in rooms that you're not in. And so I have so much gratitude to Charles. Charles Kim, shout out. But fast forward that, and that ended up being a 3.5 year journey from meeting Charles to this book coming out in the world. And essentially, I guess if I think about not only that 3.5 year journey, or even this 15 year advocacy journey of starting Diversability and creating this disability community, and in addition, this almost 30 year journey of living in this disabled body, a part of me thought, how can I contribute my voice to what's already out there so that we can shift attitudes and perceptions around disability? Because we can have as many laws in place, and we do here in the US, and I'm learning now that this book is coming out in paperback in the UK. This year marks the 35th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act here in the US. And in the UK, it marks the 15th anniversary of something called the Equality Act, which ended up being a follow-up to something called the Disability Discrimination Act. A bunch of different acts all got rolled up. As I now learn more about UK disability history, but also acknowledge that I come at this being born and raised in the US. So feel very grateful for our UK partners and the UK disability community for helping to see that this book was something that they wanted across the pond. But yeah, I think for me, I think the last frontier is attitudes. And that's the hardest thing to change. And part of that change requires media and journalists to get up to speed. Part of that change requires the types of children's books and the types of children's media that we are sharing with our kids. It involves ensuring that we have better representation and equitable pay for disabled people who are engaging in the workforce or having opportunities when we are counted out of work opportunities to find pathways to entrepreneurship or even creative entrepreneurship. So that became this book, the Anti-Ableist Manifesto.
Thank you so much for sharing that story. And you touched on like the disability history, which you have a whole section about in your book. And I really love that you've structured it in like such an organized fashion. Like the first part is about like your personal journey, and then it's more like the interpersonal, and then it's the societal. And in that, you give reflection questions for every chapter. They're all very like bite-sized, and I really appreciate that you sort of interwove your own personal story with also very practical, like here's examples of like how do you take this concept and then do something with it. And as you were talking about like that sense of changing the attitude, I just wanted to point out that the two of the chapters at the beginning of the book are disability is not a bad word, and disability is not a bad thing. So would you talk a little more about like the destigmatizing of disability and how that and what impact that creates?
Yes. So first I'll just address the structure of the book, which is this framework called Me, We, Us. And this is a framework that I learned through different social impact spaces about how we can make transformative change. So as you mentioned, the book is structured. I renamed them because just for clarity, but essentially it's Anti-Ableism and Me. What are the things I need to know about disability, ableism, how it shows up? What are the things I can do just by myself, educating myself? Then Anti-Ableism and We, what can we do in community with each other in our interpersonal relationships? And then Anti-Ableism and Us, which is how can we create this type of systemic change that will create a lasting impact so that not only do we as a disability community survive in this current environment, but we also have the opportunity to thrive. So to your point about disability is not a bad thing and disability is not a bad word, which actually end up appearing. So if you make it to the end of the book, I introduce the Anti-Ableist Manifesto art, which are about 30 statements that appear, and I'm holding up a postcard that have different phrases on them, like disability is not a bad word or a bad thing, disability is intersectional, etc. And they're all inspired by chapters of the book. So essentially, if you're like, I'm not quite sure where to start on my own anti-ableist journey, maybe you take a look at the artwork, you figure out if there are a statement or statements on the art that resonate with you, and then go and read about those chapters or do an online search. So part of why I had those two chapters, and actually we had discussions internally about whether those two chapters should be combined, but I saw them as very different. So to me, disability is not a bad word is specifically about the word disability in itself. And I want to say, and I haven't done enough research on this, and maybe I will after this conversation, but I have a feeling that right around the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, euphemisms of disability like differently abled or even special needs, which I know is still used a lot, or unique abilities were all used instead of saying disability. We were so uncomfortable with the word disability that in order to feel more welcoming to disabled people, or maybe for non-disabled people's comfort, we started using words that we started using words and euphemisms when we really meant disability. So what I tell people is, when talking about disabilities, use the word disability, unless a disabled person tells you they prefer different language for themselves. But all of that to say, again, here in the US, our rights are enshrined by identifying as disabled. It's called the Americans with Disabilities Act. And I feel, even in looking at my own journey, I think I have found that, and I mentioned this in the book too, the more that you say the word disability, it actually loses its meaning over time. This is called semantic satiation. And I will meet people, and even people in the disability community, who tell me that they get the ick when they hear the word disability or when they say it. And it makes me curious about how much influence society and media has had that we have placed so much assumed negative value judgment in this word disabled. And I have a hard time believing that over 1 billion of us globally are bad or broken. We're just disabled. It means that our body and our minds work a little differently. Then when we move to the chapter, Disability is Not a Bad Thing, that was really around looking at the ways that the more advanced way to say this is the way we weaponize disability terms. And more simply put, that means the ways that we use disability terms, as metaphors for something else, and that something else is bad. So some examples could be phrases like, I was paralyzed by fear, when, paralysis is a real disability that some of us have, or saying, the blind leading the blind, where in that case, maybe the embedded assumption is that you lack direction. But I will say some of my blind friends are amazing at wayfinding. And so again, when we're thinking about using these terms as metaphors, or even, the media loves a headline of a disabled person overcoming their disability. 2 questions I always encourage, which you may have read about in the book, but number 1 is, what are you really trying to say? And then number 2 is there another way that you could say it instead? So for example, if a media headline says, Tiffany Yu overcame her disability, what they're really trying to say is that maybe I overcame adversity related to living with a disability in an inaccessible world. And then again, I'm still disabled, so I haven't overcome my disability, right? Maybe I've overcome negative perceptions that you have around someone who lives with a disability, right? So that's part of the reason why we made them 2 separate chapters, because I do think that they're 2 separate concepts.
That makes a lot of sense. And I'm glad that it was right at the beginning too. And I also wanted to touch on the neurodivergent community is part of the disability community and is often what's considered a non-apparent disability. And so would you talk a little about like non-apparent disabilities? I know this is something that like I myself am sort of leaning into, right? Like my understanding of being neurodivergent came later in life, and then also like, and specifically around like being autistic, and then also coming to that understanding of like, oh, this is a disability. And I love like, especially around that chapter of like, this isn't a bad thing. This isn't a bad word. So even as we unlearn our own internalized ableism, which we'll touch on later, of, but yeah, so maybe if you would touch on just that aspect of non-apparent disability.
Yeah, so non-apparent disabilities, or you may hear them referred to as hidden disabilities or invisible disabilities. And part of why I use non-apparent disabilities is sometimes there are subtexts by calling something a hidden disability. Maybe it sounds like someone may be trying to hide their disability, which they aren't. With invisible disability, we don't want to make people feel more invisible than they already might feel within our community and taking up space. So non-apparent just says a non-apparent disability may become apparent at any time. And so I actually learned that PTSD is considered part of neurodivergence as well. But what's interesting is depending on who you talk to, people who maybe have ADHD or are autistic may not consider someone who lives with PTSD to be part of the neurodivergent community. But neurodivergent, what's that?
I said they are incorrect.
But I also think it highlights, I don't know what it highlights. It highlights like who belongs and who doesn't. And I think in my work, I've always been so centered in community. And even if I look at my own trajectory, it's always been this desire to find the places that I belong. And even when I tell people about my work, they'll come to me and they'll say, oh, I have diabetes or I have asthma. Does that count? And I'm not here to police whether you consider yourself to be in the disability community or not. But neurodivergence can be considered a type of disability. And I mentioned this. I wanted to make sure that I called it out in, I believe, at least 2 chapters in the book around non-apparent disabilities, because the majority of disabilities, 70 to 80% of them, are not apparent. This can include chronic illnesses, substance use addiction, mental health disabilities, neurodivergent disabilities. And, there has been a conversation from some people who have non-apparent disabilities who say they don't consider living with their disability, whatever it is, a disability. I think I made that confusing. So mainly we'll hear from people who say, hey, I don't consider my ADHD or my autism to be a disability. And I do address this in the book too, but really underlying that is, again, negative value judgment we have around what it means to be disabled, because those are disabilities. And but I will also say that if your introduction to the disability community is through wanting to better understand people who have neurodivergent disabilities or wanting to better understand neurodiversity as a whole, then that's your introduction. But it's been interesting because I have another friend who has an apparent disability like I do, and she says, I get asked questions about neurodiversity in the workplace. And I said, and she's like, I'm not quite sure how to respond to that. And I say, well, underlying that is also, how can I better understand and support disability in the workplace, right? And I'll get questions from people, and I'm sure this is a better question for you about how we can better support people who have non-apparent disabilities in the workplace. And my response to them is, if we make the admin burden so high or we discriminate against people already who have apparent disabilities, it isn't creating a level of psychological safety for people who have non-apparent disabilities, who can essentially choose how much they decide to share or disclose, but it may also mean that they may not be getting the access or accommodations or support that they need to do their job best, right? I know I went on a huge digression over there,
No,
but I
that makes
do
a lot
think
of
it's
sense.
so, and I feel, and I'm so excited you reached out. Like, even in the intro, I should have mentioned, like, we met through Threads. So
Yeah.
it works. There are people on there. But social media is so powerful too in the way that it's connecting disabled people who maybe thought they were weird or the only for a long time. And I actually think that's how ableism gets its power. It's by keeping us intentionally isolated so we feel like we don't have any power or influence. Which is why, again, I talk all day long about community. And even if it's like, okay, if joining a disability community doesn't feel supportive for you, maybe you can join an autistic community or maybe a neurodivergent community. I have a friend who runs this group called Minds of All Kinds that's focused on neurodivergence and neurodiversity. But yeah, those are the places where I think we realize we're not alone, and then we start to get the confidence to know that we have the ability to make change.
I really love that. Like, especially pointing out that like that online community making can be really powerful, especially if you're feeling isolated, that this can be a way to access that community. So I would like to like move into that sense of like defining like ableism, anti-ableism. These are the big aspects of this book. Would you share a bit about like each of these and how we can begin to become anti-ableist?
So, the definition of ableism that I use is that ableism is a system of oppression that devalues someone based on the way their body and or mind works. So, similar to other types of oppression, it is the devaluing of another person based on some aspect of their identity. What I think is interesting in that definition that I shared is there's no mention of accessibility or disability because we devalue people's bodies and or minds based on their skin color and also based on their gender. I mean, based on so many different things. So all of that to say, and I don't know if that makes people feel better, but ableism is all around. I even think about, for someone like me who can only use one of my arms, like buttons are difficult. Zippers, I was actually going through some of my old TikToks because there's been a lot of conversation around TikTok recently. And one of them was a challenge to zip a zipper with one hand to try to raise awareness. In this case, it was for people who are recovering from stroke, who may the stroke may have impacted one side of their body. But it's those little things that we don't even think about. So anti-ableism is really what actions are we taking to equitably value someone regardless of how their body and or mind works. So in terms of where can we get started, I guess I turn back to the Anti-Ableist Manifesto art because the answer is different. So for someone like you, Jenny Lee, who runs a podcast, my recommendations for you may be, hey, you are running a show, so you are creating content. If someone is not able to see, are they still able to engage with your content? The answer is yes, they can listen. They can listen to your podcast. If someone is not able to hear, can they engage with your podcast? And I'm not quite sure.
Right.
But
With
now
like captions and things.
yes, with captions and, there are great tools. I use otter.ai, which I think is free up to 3 hours per month, but it keeps changing. Or there's one called Descript, or you can upload the video to YouTube, which has this great auto captions feature. We recommend that if you do have the time, energy, or the spoons to go in and update them. But at the same time, this is also where community care comes in. So sometimes I've seen, for example, if someone is posting on social media and they don't have the energy to write an image description, they'll say, hey, if someone in the community can help write an image description, and then someone will. And this is why I actually love our community. So that's an example specific for podcast. I'll share an example specific from just writing this book. So one example will be the end point, which is you have a book. The book is available in hardcover here in the US, paperback in those places you mentioned in the intro, coming soon, and audio and ebook. So if you are, so you have 3 different ways that you can engage with the content of the book, and you're still reading a book. Listening to an audio books are books. I think I had a thread post on that, or there was a lot of conversation around that. But even if I scale it back a little bit, I did receive an advance to write the book. And part of what I'm really passionate about is trying to figure out ways that I can, I guess the short version is to say, support disabled people's livelihoods, because not only is it expensive for us to live, we make less. So I call this like the disability economy or the disability market, which is actually $13 trillion globally. So
Yeah.
So we're out there. But with the book Advance, I was able to hire a disabled designer who actually designed the manifesto art. I hired a disabled editor to help me think about how to weave in some of the stories that we receive throughout the book. I hosted our first book launch event at a bookstore that was a disability-owned bookstore here in Los Angeles. For some of the people who did contribute stories, we were able to pay them a small stipend if they wanted. And so these are the ways that I said, hey, I got this. I mean, and not everyone has, money that they can go hire a bunch of people, but maybe you love candles, or maybe you love books. Are there disability-owned bookstores that you can buy your book through? And if you love candles, because I said candles already, there are actually, there's only one now, but there were 2 disability-owned actually now I know 2. There are 2 disability-owned candle companies that I know that I can recommend for you. So there are disability-owned companies at all different parts of the supply chain. But again, coming back to like podcast or even social media, it's again those 2 questions of, if I'm not able to see the content, can I still engage? This is, static posts on Instagram. If I can't hear the content, are there still ways that I can engage? And with that, you can add captions onto your video. And then it's like, if you can't see or hear the video, are you still able to engage? And this is why you'll see, at least on my videos, I'll include like a video description and transcript at the end of my captions, or put it in a new comment.
I really love that. And I feel like this highlights what the feeling of the book is too, around how you just have so many great, very practical ways people can take action. Because that's what this book is about, really. And I appreciate those that you offered me as well, because I know there are, as you were mentioning it, I'm like, okay, yes, I've done some of these things, but not all the things. And I really do want to be better at that. So
at the same time too, like I don't know if you do show notes for your podcast, but I remember that doing them for me took a lot of time. My podcast, it's been on hiatus for a couple of years because it's a labor of love. It's a lot.
Yeah.
What I think is amazing is, okay, once you upload it and it's, people can listen to it on Spotify, now you have an option to upload the video. And I actually think the last time I uploaded a video to Spotify, they put in captions. But then I don't know if you have a YouTube account, you can put it on YouTube and it's got those captions there too. And then, content, you got to be everywhere. Sometimes you're like everywhere and nowhere at the same time. But even sometimes, I'll post a piece of content and I'll refer people over like, hey, if this isn't accessible to you, I have the full transcript over on Instagram. Ideally, and I'm still learning too, and sometimes these platforms have character limits and stuff. Ideally, you would all want it to be in the same place. But if not, at least we're trying to figure out workarounds for it.
Well, one of the things that I use is Riverside. It's this which is where you're at now. And they really integrate a lot of AI. So it'll pull out the whole transcript, all the notes, all the chapter, timestamps and stuff. So it's made it really accessible to do this. So I
didn't know that Riverside had incorporated those features. And that's also another reason I didn't get to talk about this as much in the book, but AI to me is really enhancing accessibility, right? Even for you just talking, even like meeting summaries, or even as a podcaster now, to be able to have those with the timestamps and the summary is like now you don't have to go in and do all of that. And I also think, even as so in part one, we talked a little bit about inclusive language. If you do have questions, you could ask ChatGPT, like, hey, here's what I'm trying to say. Would you be able to check it if I'm using any language that might be seen as offensive to disabled people, and suggest some alternatives instead? So I know I have some tables in the book where I include some common ableist phrases and alternatives to use instead, but there are so many. I mean, this is the beautiful thing about language. And now with AI is like, now we have a tool that can check ableism.
I love that so much. Yeah, hopefully accurately, but like it's a really amazing tool, and I'm glad that you sort of made that connection between how it is expanding accessibility, or it can. I know briefly I mentioned the concept of unlearning internalized ableism, as this is a part of anti-ableism, is also that internal aspect. Would you maybe say a little bit about like what has helped folks with this process of unlearning that internalized ableism?
Yeah, so internalized ableism is when a disabled person thinks that they're broken or less than or need to be fixed. And actually, maybe I was like, maybe I think I did a pretty good job of defining it like that. But here it says internalized ableism is a form of internalized oppression, which is defined as the internalization of negative messages and beliefs about oneself and one's group that are perpetuated by a society or system that oppresses them. It can manifest as self-hatred, low self-esteem, self-doubt, and a lack of self-worth, and can lead to individuals internalizing negative stereotypes and biases about their own group and accepting the dominant narrative about their own worth and value. It can be a significant barrier to self-empowerment and the ability to challenge and resist oppression. For example, it means thinking that we should lower our standards for romantic relationships because who would want to be with someone with a disability? Or not asking for accommodations, accessibility, or the support we're entitled to because we believe we are a burden. And I think even the earlier conversation around people who have neurodivergent disabilities not identifying as disabled is also an example of internalized ableism. So ways to combat it, is different for every person, which I know is the catch-all answer to most
That's
questions.
okay.
But for me personally, it was meeting other disabled people. It was seeing the possibility of who I could become, not despite my disability, but by embracing disability and disability culture and pride and community. And this is why I spend so much time talking about disability pride, which is another form of what is called disabled joy. So disabled joy is, and sometimes I'm like, oh, maybe I should focus more of my content on like advocacy stuff. And I'm sharing a video of like me going biking or, getting to the top of a hike and really enjoying the view. It's just, how can I savor my existence in a society, that tells me that as a woman of color, as a disabled person, or even as a woman, that we are devalued, right? Based on these different systems of oppression. So yeah, meeting other disabled people, because I remember in my earlier years of starting Diversability, I would go and meet with different disability advocates. And I still remember this one conversation I had where the person I was meeting with, I was talking about just this period of time where I had really low self-esteem, low self-worth, recounting a lot of what I just named to you in that definition of internalized oppression. And she's like, and she expressed concern, and she was like, Tiffany, I'm sorry that you had to experience that. And, I hope that you see the other side. And I guess I want to acknowledge that as someone who has acquired my disability, I experienced disability grief. And I remind myself that there are two stages of grief. One's called acceptance and one's called meaning, that I actually do feel like I have found on that grief journey. But I had to make space for those softer, hard moments of once writing with my dominant right arm to now relearning how to do it with my left hand. And I'm so fascinated by how agile and adaptable our bodies are. And at the same time, I will not go out and say that my disabilities are the greatest gift of my life. I'm not proud to live with my disabilities, but I'm proud to be part of the disability community and be part of this group of advocates, of movers and shakers who are trying to show how extraordinarily ordinary we are. We're boring. And and I don't have a new project I'm working on every single day, you know, and some days I just want to watch Netflix. And I want to know if the couple's going to get married on Love is Blind. And and so it's yeah, I think for me, and I'm still unlearning internalized ableism. Like I remember a couple of years ago, so I'm really proud that at Diversability we've always been entirely disabled, led and run. But when I was earlier on and starting to build out our team, I remember we had opened up the applications to anyone who wanted to apply. And I had a non-disabled candidate and I had a disabled candidate. And I noticed myself asking very different questions to the disabled candidate about their capacity to do the job. And I had to catch myself. And so I also and I had to catch myself and I was like, I went and asked those questions to a non-disabled candidate, and a disabled candidate applied knowing what the scope of work was for the job, that they thought they could do the job. So why am I questioning that, right? And so I even had to catch myself on that as like in my own unlearning journey. So I don't know if we ever fully unlearn our internalized ableism. You know, I talk about in the book, there's something called lateral ableism as well.
Yes, I was going to touch on that. So yes, thank you.
Do you want me to talk a little bit about lateral ableism?
Yeah, because it is very much connected to internalized ableism, right? So like if I'm holding that prejudice within myself, it is going to come out, right? It'll likely come out also, which is, I think, is a part of lateral ableism.
Yeah, so lateral ableism, and it's so interesting because I read this book so many times, so I like know the exact page that it's going to be on.
That's awesome.
But hold on, I flipped too far. So lateral ableism is when we essentially, it's kind of like a disability hierarchy. We think like some disabilities are better than others. So people may say comments, and actually here, okay, so lateral ableism is when certain disabled people do not consider or fight for the rights of all disabled people. More simply, it's when a disabled person is ableist toward another disabled person. Andrew Polrang uses the example of people with physical disabilities bolstering their own social status and acceptance by emphasizing that they don't have mental impairments, with assertions like, my legs are disabled, not my brain, or at least there's nothing wrong with my mind. Statements like this reinforce harm toward people of mental disabilities. And another example is when we label someone high-functioning, such as high-functioning autism or high-functioning anxiety, ultimately denying us the support that we might need. At the same time, those who are labeled low-functioning are seen as not being capable of doing anything. So tackling lateral ableism is necessary to our collective liberation, because nobody's free until everybody's free. And so essentially, I mean, even recently, there was an opportunity to make comments about sub-minimum wage and potentially phasing out paying disabled people below minimum wage, which is still legal in, I think, 30 states, over 30 states, in the majority of states, I guess I'll say. But I have never been someone who has had to work in a sheltered workshop and been paid below minimum wage. And yet I still want to use all my power and privilege to make a comment and make people aware of that, because I think by lifting all of us up, if not minimum wage, which is still low, to a livable wage, then we all benefit, right? So it's making sure that all of us are here supporting each other. but also still something that I'm working on, right? I talk about this in the book too, where, I've even had people in the disability community who tell me, like, Tiffany, you're very well spoken, right? Which for people who have speech related disabilities, is a comment that reinforces lateral ableism. Or they'll tell me that at least you're attractive, right? And I talk about like attractiveness privilege in the book, and attractiveness is subjective, but also like, given the way that some disabilities look, right? People feel more comfortable looking at someone who has a specific type of disability versus someone else who maybe their disability manifests in a different way. And so, yeah, ultimately I kind of come back to the idea that the greatest, like, we all have gifts to impart on the world. And I think part of the journey, not only as individuals, but also as a collective, is to figure out what those gifts are. Because I have a hard time believing, like, for example, I actually think there might be a job out there where someone goes through and they clean the transcripts when, AI has done their auto transcript job, right? There's someone who would really enjoy doing that. Or I remember, when we would have interns and before we could fully onboard them, we had them write image descriptions for our social media, right? And that's like, that's something where they were learning about accessibility, but it also benefited anyone who was engaging with our content as well.
I love that so much because I think it also, something about like how you were describing that came back to that me, we, us, the way it's all connected, right? Because we started off with like internalized ableism to lateral ableism to how we can be addressing this as a society. And that is so, so important. I know the last part of your book is all about societal change, and there are 10 chapters in there, so we won't be able to hit on everything. But maybe if you wouldn't mind, like maybe specifically touching on like supporting disability entrepreneurship, because that's one of the focuses of this podcast. And then yeah, maybe something about like the advocacy that we could all be doing.
Yeah, so here in the US, we've had a law in place for 35 years that has is technically supposed to prohibit discrimination against people with disabilities in the workplace. And yet we are seeing our unemployment numbers still be twice that of our non-disabled peers. Part of the reason why I bring that up is I appreciate all of the upskilling programs that are available for disabled people. Learn how to code. I actually did the coding one, so we'll start there. But even with all of that, the odds are still stacked against us. And I have heard stories from my friends from a friend who is blind, who has 2 master's degrees, and still is having a difficult time getting a job. So part of why I shared all of that context is when traditional workplaces have counted us out or are not even giving us a chance to get interviewed or, even through an internship or apprenticeship or a fellowship, any of the ships, have an opportunity to show you what we can do, we turn to entrepreneurship. And I call it entrepreneurship or creative entrepreneurship because the creator economy, like posting on Instagram or TikTok, has actually created and supported livelihoods for so many disabled people who, again, had been essentially counted out of traditional workspaces. So I'm a big fan of disability entrepreneurship. I do cite someone named Diego Mariscal, who runs Together International, which is one of the largest accelerators focused on disabled entrepreneurs. And there are a couple too. There's one called Synergy's Work about better supporting disabled entrepreneurs. So it's interesting because I consider myself a creative entrepreneur, but I have a hard time. I've had a hard time owning that I am a small business owner. I think in some ways and I like haven't hit the types of milestones that I would think make someone an entrepreneur, but I actually think that's the point, is maybe we are redefining entrepreneurship, that it doesn't have to look a certain way, right? The thing that takes up the most of my time, running our community at Diversability, actually supports my livelihood the least. And luckily, I would consider myself a content creator, so I can do partnerships, and sometimes we'll go out and do speaking engagements. And now I have a book, although books don't really make money, but that's a different thing. But in some ways, all of those together have made it so that I'm able to support my livelihood and also still continue to work on advocacy and build our community. So yeah, I talk about, so as you mentioned, in each chapter, there are reflection questions, and depending on which format of the book you have, if you have the print or digital copy, they'll be highlighted in gray boxes. But in addition to that, I've also included kind of like action items that people can take, and depending on, again, what version of the book you have, those are outlined in, those are just outlined in black. So even in the chapter on disability entrepreneurship, I include like a list of, I'm looking at it now, a list of like 7 different things you can do to help support disabled entrepreneurs. But at a baseline level, like I was talking about before, really looking at all the different areas of your supply chain. And if you do have the means, and by supply chain, I mean, where, like, again, if you love candles, or actually we'll go back to the books, like if you love books, like where are you getting your books? And figuring out ways that you can support disabled people in all different aspects of things that you shop for. And they're like, for example, like Mazzeria is a deaf-owned pizzeria. And so if you want pizza, like that's a place that you can go and check out. But I think we're also needing better policies in place to support disabled people becoming small business owners. So if you are part of the 4 million Americans who is on disability benefits, having a successful small business sometimes comes at the expense of you and your life-enhancing disability benefits. So really, I think continuing to think, and I know now there are like Able accounts that you can get that help support that. And I'm still learning more about those benefits programs. And then I tried to summarize them as best as I could, but information just continues to change.
I feel like that's really powerful. And I mean, it relates to, I think, a lot of the book is really inviting us to just become much more aware, ask ourselves these powerful questions like, who am I listening to? Where am I getting my stuff? How can I make this more inclusive? Who am I working with?
And I will say, like, even if you don't have the means, like a share, or like, again, I guess I'll talk about the book because the book is top of mind. But like, if you don't have the means to buy a copy of the book, you can request it at your library. You can like the author's posts. You can share them and comment on them, because all of that engagement tells the algorithm, hey, we want to show more people this. And we can equate that to, I mean, as an author, in some ways, I feel like this book became its own small business. But think about that in terms of disabled entrepreneurs that you support. Like, any engagement really, really helps. And what's funny is my partner has like 20 followers on Instagram. And I was talking to him the other day about how a comment just like means a lot. And he's like, oh, because I think his profile picture is a cat. So he's not one to usually comment. So I can tell him and suggest, but since it's not what he usually does, he still likes all the posts, but he's not a big commenter. But I'm like, hey, I'll take the like.
Because like you said, there's a lot of ways that are free, that can mean a lot to disabled entrepreneurs, like engaging with the content, following folks. And that's so important too. So I know we only have a few more minutes, but you have mentioned a few times about diversability. And I was wondering if there's anything you wanted to talk about in regard to like upcoming events or anything. I think I saw one in LA, so I know you all are based there. And then I know the fires recently occurred too. But yeah, is there anything you want to mention about diversability?
Yeah. So I'm like, where do I even start? So
Yeah.
the best way to support us is by just following Diversability on Instagram. That will keep you up to date on all of the different events that we're doing. We're actually hosting events every single week, but in a membership community that we run, but we do open some of them up to the broader community. So we have a disability history event coming up. We actually have the author of a book who did a lot of research about sub-minimum wage coming to speak sometime in mid-February, I want to say. As you mentioned, we're starting to explore what it would look like to host in-person events. And we had January 29th on the calendar for a while. And so we've actually shifted the event. It doesn't really change anything about the event. We've shifted it so that all the proceeds benefit fire relief efforts supporting disabled people. And two of our panelists are actually running some really great mutual aid efforts here in LA. And I think just a nice time for whether you call it a respite. As we're recording this, we have another wind advisory. It's like we can't get a break, but
Seriously.
the past couple of weeks, it's been devastating, and the recovery is going to take a really long time. But it's been so touching, and I've been moved by how the community has rallied together. You know, I'm seeing posts saying, we've gotten too many donations, like no more donations, please, or like, we don't need any more volunteers. But I think I would just encourage your listeners to think about how even as the media headlines have moved on, we're still in recovery. But yeah, check out Diversability. Instagram is the best place. We also have a Linktree, Linktree/Diversability, which will include links to RSVP for any events that we have coming out. And we have a Substack newsletter as well that people can check out.
And a Facebook group, right?
Yes.
Yes.
And
I'm a part
if
of that.
and if you are looking for community, I will say I've been really proud that Diversability for some disabled people, our Facebook group is the first disability community that they join. And as someone who has been actively building communities now for over 15 years, I know there will be a time and a place where you're really active in a community or you really need it in your life. And so I used to be really sad when community members would, not be as active anymore. But then I realized for that moment in time when they needed us, we were there. And when they don't need us, we're still there. So it's a very loosely moderated community. It's a lot of people kind of sharing different things that they're working on. But what I hope it becomes, I think we've been around for too long for me to hope what it becomes. We've been around, that online community has been around for 10 years. It's growing on its own. I think people are finding us on their own. But it hopefully, I think to me, becomes a place that continues to create possibility. That says, oh, this person is sharing their newsletter or their podcast, like maybe I can create one. Or maybe I can ask if I can be a guest on their show. And I've been excited to see kind of what types of collaborations have come out of that.
I love that so much. And you have mentioned over the course of this conversation lots of ways to engage with you in your work. And I even mentioned in the beginning, TiffanyYu.com, a hub of probably links and things to be able to explore what Tiffany is doing. But with these last few minutes, is there anything that we haven't touched on yet that you wanted to share, or like your vision for the impact of this book?
Ooh. I think my goal with the book was for it to reach as many people as possible. And I actually got a question. The book made it onto the reading list for a course that my friend is teaching. So I'm like, ooh, we made it. But I got to speak with their students today, and one of them asked, like, has anything surprised you since the book has launched? And I think the fact that it's resonating with readers and that, like you said, I mean, I tried to make it actionable, but I didn't realize that people would actually like do things right away or start to think about doing things right away. But to see the conversations that are happening around the book with people who don't even know me and may never even meet me has been pretty cool. So if you can, maybe request the book at your local library if it's not there yet. That's totally free to do if you have a library card. And we love our libraries. I hosted book events at some libraries. I'm also listening to my own audiobook for the first time because I checked it out from my local library.
It's awesome.
I think I'm halfway through. But it's also a good refresher to me because I'm like, oh, like I read this book so many times before it came out in October, and now it's January. So maybe I'll listen to it again so that I can remember what I said and where things are.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. And I also really hope that this book gets spread far and wide. I'm going to go to my library and request it today. So thank you so much for being here, Tiffany.
Awesome.